Over the past 4 years, more than 50 volunteers from the Weminuche Audubon Society have participated in a citizen science project in forests around Pagosa Springs, Colorado. We've been studying the composition and structure of bird communities in dry mixed conifer forests in our area. The primary scientific question we addressed through this project concerns the response of the bird community to wildland fuel reduction treatments. That is, the use of prescribed fire and shrub layer mowing, also known as mastication. But through the conduct of this project, we also aimed to improve participants' understanding of forest ecology and fire ecology, and improve our birding skills, and, in addition, learn how field studies are planned and conducted. The data set we've generated over the past 4 years allows us to tell an interesting story about the bird community in our area. A story about commonness versus rarity of bird species, and feeding behavior, and nesting behavior, and migration patterns of the species we've encountered, and the importance of birds in the health of forested ecosystems as well. That is what this video is all about. Note that each year we've produced detailed reports of our findings, along with videos summarizing what we've accomplished. You can find links to these reports and videos in the comments section below, and by going to the website for the Weminuche Audubon Society. Throughout this video, we will be developing an analogy between biodiversity and rivets. Yes, rivets. Let's see if you can capture the message of this analogy of rivets in flight as we proceed through the video. In our study, we monitored the bird community at 4 different sites around Pagosa Springs. The Turkey Springs site was subject to prescribed fire in the late spring of 2019, just as we were starting our project. We also had a study site at a place called Fawn Gulch. The shrub layer at that site was mowed or masticated in 2017. For comparison, we set up a study site in the forests at Jackson Mountain where there had been no fire or logging activity for many decades. These 3 sites were dominated by ponderosa pine, with shrub layers of Gambel's oak and other woody species as well. The wildland fuel reduction treatments applied to the Turkey Springs and Fawn Gulch sites resulted in very different shrub layer qualities compared to the Jackson Mountain site, which is why those sites were selected for study. In 2022, we added a 4th site to the study, also at Jackson Mountain. But this site is different from our other study sites by having a more diverse array of tree species and greater patchiness in the understory shrub layer. The new Jackson Mountain site is dominated by white fir, Douglas fir, and aspen, along with ponderosa pine. The tree canopy layer at the new Jackson Mountain site is more closed, resulting in more shade and a more patchy understory shrub layer. The new Jackson Mountain site is part of a long-term study called Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change, which will apply selective tree harvesting strategies to this site to determine how the forest will respond to anticipated warmer and drier climates likely to affect our area in the future. We wanted to establish a baseline data set on the bird community in that area before the selective logging treatments are applied, which is scheduled for 2023. We used established bird monitoring protocols in our study that can be found in the scientific literature. At each site, we located 15 monitoring points that were visited regularly between late May and mid-July by teams of volunteers. At each point, observers would watch and listen for birds for 6-minute intervals before moving on to the next point. In 2022, we added the use of the Merlin Bird Identification app for identifying birds by song. This was only used to confirm bird songs that could be verified by volunteer observers. Other details of our field methodology can be found in our annual reports and videos. Before we move on, let's address the primary scientific question we set out to examine in this study. That is, how do birds respond to wildland fuel reduction treatments, such as prescribed fire or shrub layer mowing or mastication? Well, basically, what we found was that the bird community at the Turkey Spring site, which was subject to prescribed fire in 2019, was less diverse than the bird community observed at either the Fawn Gulch site, which was mowed in 2017, or the Jackson Mountain site, which is the most natural of the three sites. By the third year of the study, it appeared that the bird community at the Turkey Spring site had recovered pretty nicely in terms of numbers of birds and bird species. The Fawn Gulch site had an apparently very healthy assemblage of bird species throughout the course of the study, and the Jackson Mountain site had the most diverse bird community of all three sites. We associated the patterns in bird species numbers and numbers of birds counted with the development of the understory shrub layer. The healthier and more developed the shrub layer, the more diverse the bird community was found to be. Well, this shrub layer complexity, which ecologists would associate with the term foliage height diversity, plays an important role in determining the quality of habitat for many bird species, both as a source of food, but also for nesting habitat and protection from predators. Feeding behavior, nesting behavior, and migration patterns will be discussed later on, but let's address the commonness versus rarity issue first. To help understand patterns in commonness versus rarity of the bird species we encountered, we calculated a simple commonness score for each species. The commonness score is pretty simple. A species was assigned a point for each site where they were observed in any year of the study, and those points were added together to calculate a commonness score. Since our study included 3 sites in each year and went on for 4 years, the maximum cumulative score for a species present at all sites across all years of the study is 12. A bird species encountered at only one site in only 1 year of the 4 years of the study would receive a score of 1, and so on. The 9 most common species in order of cumulative abundance were the American robin, pygmy nuthatch, violet green swallow, western tanager, northern flicker, yellow-rumped warbler, Steller's jay, white-breasted nuthatch, and the hairy woodpecker. An additional 13 species earned a commonness score of 10 or 11. Examples of these included the chipping sparrow, Plumbeus vireo, western wood pewee, and dark-eyed junco. There were 32 species that were seen in small numbers at only 1 or 2 sites over the course of the study. Now, just some notable examples of these species include the band-tailed pigeon, dusky grouse, Hammond's flycatcher, McGillivray's warbler, red-naped sapsucker, and the evening grosbeak. The bird species used as examples for having scores of 11 or less are all considered of concern to conservation biologists because of declining population numbers, which is true for the northern flicker, violet-green swallow, and western tanagers that even scored 12s on our scale as well. The details concerning bird species population trends are discussed in our annual report in detail, but these findings raise an important question. Should we be more concerned about patterns in the distribution and abundance of common species, or focus more attention on the uncommon or rare species? Indeed, of the 85 species observed in our study, 39, or almost half, are undergoing serious declines in their population numbers. These include the Grace's warbler, Cason's finch, Virginia's warbler, McGillivray's warbler, Williamson's sapsucker, Townsend's solitaire, and Hammond's flycatcher. Notably, the Cason's finch and Grace's warbler have commonness scores of 6, while the Hammond's flycatcher was commonly seen at both Jackson Mountain sites in 2022. The issues conservation biologists consider as they prioritize how to respond to declining population numbers for any species are complex and beyond the scope of this project. But perhaps it would be helpful to know more about how the bird species we have observed function in our forested ecosystems so that our management decisions could be better informed. Most of the bird species we have encountered in our study are insectivorous, at least during the breeding season when we have our monitoring program in place. This is important for at least 2 reasons. Most of the bird species we studied eat various insects that, if left unchecked, could defoliate or endanger the survival of many tree and shrub species. And secondly, about half of the bird species at our sites are migratory. They come to this area because of the abundance of food resources available during the late spring and early summer breeding season. We'll say more about that coming up. Ecologists categorize bird feeding behavior based on where the birds search for food or how they find their food. The strategies of greatest interest in our study are referred to as ground brush foraging, timber foliage searching, aerial flycatchers, and timber drilling gleaning. Now, in addition, there are corvids and raptors and nectar-feeding birds and that sort of thing, but those are in such small numbers in our study that we're not going to focus on those. Ground brush foraging species were most abundant in all years at the Turkey Springs, Fawn Gulch, and Jackson Mountain sites, with 33 species falling into this category. Examples of these include several very common species, such as the American robin and dark-eyed junco, house wren, and the green-tailed towhee. But also included in the groundbrush foraging feeding guild were bird species of concern because of their declining populations, and that includes the band-tailed pigeon, Cason's finch, evening grosbeak, and pine siskin. Bird species in the timber foliage searching feeding strategy, represented by 12 species, were the second most abundant guild at Turkey Springs, Fawn Gulch, and the original Jackson Mountain site. This includes species such as McGillivray's warbler and Plumbus vireo and western tanager. All of these are of concern due to declining population numbers as well. Interestingly, the timber foliage searching feeding guild was the most abundant grouping at the new Jackson Mountain site, instead of the groundbrush foraging grouping that we saw at the other sites. This was probably due to the effects of a more closed tree canopy, which reduced the density of understory shrubs in some places over much of the site. At least it was more patchy. Among the most abundant timber foliage searching species at the new Jackson Mountain site were the red-breasted nuthatch and western tanager. Populations of the red-breasted nuthatch are considered stable, but declining populations of the western tanager is of great concern to conservationists. As mentioned earlier, there is a lot more that can be said about patterns in the feeding strategies of birds in our study areas, but for that you're encouraged to read our annual reports. Well, we're all familiar with bird nests, and I suppose we all get excited when we encounter one, especially if the young are present. Most of us are familiar with the basic cup nest that many birds build on the branches of trees or shrubs. A couple of examples include this cup nest built by a warbling vireo, or the cup-like nest built on the branches of a ponderosa pine by the western wood pewee. But one of the most interesting and exciting finds for our observers was the ground nests of the common nighthawk. We found these nests at the Turkey Springs and Fawn Gulch sites, but not at either of the Jackson Mountain sites. That tells you something about the habitat that common nighthawks prefer. They seem to favor areas that have been recently burned or thinned. We were able to observe their well-camouflaged eggs, and we were present shortly after the babies emerged from their eggs, and they were well camouflaged as well. Most of us are less familiar with cavity nesting bird species like woodpeckers. Well, they excavate cavities in standing dead trees or in weakened portions of living trees. Some cavity nesters burrow new cavities, like the northern flicker and hairy woodpecker. We call them primary cavity nesters. Other species build their nests in cavities abandoned by the primary cavity nesters. Examples of that would be the white-breasted nuthatch or violet-green swallows, or house wrens. These species are referred to as secondary cavity nesters. A couple of the species that sometimes excavate their own cavities or use abandoned cavities if available are the Lewis's woodpecker and red-naped sapsucker. Both of these species, by the way, have populations that are in steep decline. This points to the significance of snag trees, standing dead trees that primary cavity nesters and then following up with secondary cavity nesters used to build their nests. I don't think anyone can explain it better than Gene Zernhelt and Keith Bruno in the following clip.
This is a great example of an important nesting site for birds. This particular snag happens to be on Jackson Mountain, and we witnessed house wrens, violet green swallows, Williamson sapsuckers, all nesting and feeding young in this particular snag. Trees like this snag provide important nesting habitat for many birds that are cavity nesters, and recognizing this, the Forest Service has designated these trees as wildlife trees, which according to their sign are saved for their food and shelter. Do not cut. This is to let people know who are out in the forest gathering firewood that these trees are left behind for wildlife.
Great. And we typically look for a tree has to be over 15 inches in diameter, and it needs to be within 300 feet of a road, an established road. And we're aiming to put it right up here at kind of line of sight height on the tree. There it is.
Bird migration is another phenomenon that most of us are familiar with, and our data set provides us with some very interesting insights regarding bird migration and the bird communities in our area. The reasons birds migrate are complex. Most migrants come to our area in the late spring and summer months in order to reproduce, but some bird species stay here year-round or migrate only short distances in the winter. In fact, about half, or 43, of the bird species we've encountered in our study are residents in the Pagosa Springs area. And as we describe in our annual report, all but 3 of these resident species can be found here when we do our Christmas bird count in late December. Examples of resident species that are common in our study areas include the Steller's jay, pygmy nuthatch, and Williamson sapsucker. Population numbers of the Steller's jay and pygmy nuthatch are stable, but the Williamson sapsucker population numbers are in decline. So there are 42 bird species that we've encountered that migrate at least short distances further south or longer distances to Mexico, Central America, South America, and even islands in the Caribbean. Examples of these medium to long distance travelers include the western bluebird and Grace's warbler, western tanager, and western wood pewee, all of which are of concern due to decreasing population numbers. In fact, of the 43 resident bird species in our data set, 15 are showing population declines across their range that are very concerning. And of the 42 migratory bird species, 24 are in serious decline. What that means is about half of the species in our study areas are doing pretty well, which includes the resident species American robin, hairy woodpecker, and red-tailed hawk. And non-resident bird species that seem to be holding their own include the brown-headed cowbird, hermit thrush, house wren, and yellow-rumped warbler. Now, just to draw a connection between migration and nesting behavior, 5 of the cavity nesting species that are residents are in decline, and 5 of the non-resident species that are cavity nesters are also in decline. This points to the significance of the forests in our area in terms of the habitat they provide to many bird species whose populations are in decline across the range of their distribution.
Well, in this video, we've been very intentional in including a wide range of images of the bird species that we've encountered in our study. Well, the reason for this is pretty simple. It's been my experience that most of us are familiar with the most common bird species that we encounter in our surroundings, but we never seem to recognize the wide variety of birds that are around us all the time. We've also been careful to draw attention to those bird species whose population numbers are documented to be in decline, and therefore deserve greater attention when making management decisions affecting our public lands. So let's summarize what we've concluded thus far in our study. Well, first, with regard to wildland fuel reduction treatments, that's prescribed fire and shrub layer mastication, recovery of the bird communities in those sites occurred relatively quickly, within a year or two. Second, concerning the commonness versus rarity topic, well, most of the birds that we encountered belong to a small number of species, with most of the bird species represented by only a few sightings. This is common in ecological research, regardless of the organisms studied. What we don't know from our study thus far is whether the uncommon species are becoming more uncommon or maybe even rare. That outcome would be very disconcerting. As for feeding behavior, Well, the development of the shrub layer understory seems to have a strong influence on the predominance of ground brush foraging species. Well, as does the composition and density of species in the tree canopy on timber foliage searching species. Well, clearly, for insectivorous bird species, the complexity of foliage layers in the ecosystem is their buffet table. The more foliage, the more insects, and the more abundant the food resource is for those insectivorous bird species. Third, nesting sites for many bird species are not in limited supply, especially if they build their nests on branches or in the shrub layer. But for cavity nesting species, it's a totally different story. Standing dead snag trees are an important resource that need to be preserved for those species. Well, fourth, our review of the range of migratory strategies followed by bird species in our area reveals that what happens in Pagosa country does not stay in Pagosa country. Our forests are the maternity ward for bird species that travel the expanse of the Western Hemisphere. The reproductive success of migratory bird species here affects the health of not only our forests, but the forests in Mexico and Central America and South America as well. Well, finally, although not addressed explicitly in this year's video, in last year's video we focused on the experiences of our citizen science volunteers conducting this study. They overwhelmingly expressed a greater understanding of forest and fire ecology and a greater appreciation for how scientific studies are conducted and for the diversity of birds in our surrounding forests as well. Okay, so how does all of this tie in with that rivets in flight analogy that I've been making reference to? Many years ago, conservation biologists offered an analogy in their writings and lectures concerning the similarities between rivets and biodiversity. Well, that applies to the story we can tell from our project. Well, I first heard this analogy in graduate school almost 50 years ago now. Simply put, rivets are critical to the integrity of many different kinds of structures. Travel trailers, outhouses, and most important for our story, airplanes. Well, birds and planes both fly. Get it? Well, like birds, there are a large number of rivets used to make various kinds of structures and many different kinds of rivets. Just as an example, in an Airstream travel trailer, there are more than 3,000 rivets, and probably many more than that in a small private plane. Well, while there are large numbers of rivets and many different kinds of rivets in these structures, the total mass of those rivets is a very small percentage of the mass of the structure. Well, that's true for bird species in forested ecosystems as well. But they're critically important to the integrity of those ecosystems. Well, rivets fail for a lot of reasons. So how many rivets can fail before a plane is no longer airworthy or an ecosystem is irreversibly changed? Well, maybe just a few if they're in a critical location, or maybe 10% or 20% if they're not in a critical location. And well, the plane might stay airworthy under those circumstances, but what would happen if the plane encounters unusual stress, air turbulence, or bad weather? Failure would be more likely under stress than under normal circumstances, if even just a few rivets are weakened or are missing. The same applies to the ecosystems where birds reside and feed and reproduce. How many bird species can be lost before ecosystem function is adversely affected or irreversibly changed? We made the point that birds play a critical role in staving off population eruptions of herbivorous insects that can damage vegetation. Now, keep in mind that plants are the energy factories for forest and grassland and agricultural ecosystems and most other ecosystems as well. weaken this component of an ecosystem and everything could change. The reproductive success of resident and migratory bird species is therefore critical to the health of all ecosystems, and their reproductive success is dependent on the quality of habitat they encounter in their home ranges, their breeding ranges and wintering ranges, and so forth. The quality of habitats birds and other species encounter might be okay when environmental conditions are normal, but climate change is altering all of that. Most ecosystems are under stress because of warmer and drier conditions, extended droughts, and extreme weather events. The resulting loss of biodiversity is a consequence and a contributor to stress as well. So how many of those rivets or bird species can be lost before the plain is no longer airworthy or before an ecosystem fails? Engineers might be able to tell us how many rivets we can afford to lose in an airplane, but when it comes to ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity, well, we really don't know. But monitoring studies such as ours are critically important to offset what is known as the shifting baseline syndrome. That syndrome basically refers to an inadequate frame of reference to recognize changes occurring around us in our environment, including decreasing biodiversity, well, because we haven't been observant enough for long enough to see those changes. The experience of conducting a citizen science project, along with the results of our study, provides a framework for recognizing changes in our living and non-living environment by identifying the number of bird species in our area that are in decline, maybe because of changes in our local ecosystems, or maybe because of habitat destruction in overwintering grounds to our south. We hope that raising awareness and improving our understanding of the composition and structure of our local bird communities and the ecosystems of which they are a part will lead to wiser decisions that will serve to keep our rivets in flight.
There are many people and organizations who have supported this project over the years, including more than 50 volunteer observers who have invested more than 3,000 hours over the course of this study conducting the field portions of this project, and the organizational support provided by Audubon Rockies, the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership, Mountain Studies Institute, and the United States Forest Service Pagosa Ranger District. Project coordinators for the study are Herb Grover, Vice President of the Weminuche Audubon Society, Gene Zernhelt, President of Weminuche Audubon Society, and Keith Bruno, Southwest Colorado community naturalist with Audubon Rockies. The following list of participants contributed to the production of this video. Thanks for watching.